Good morning, students. Actually, it's kind of good afternoon now, but in this coronavirus setting, it doesn't really matter. Anyhow, I have a lecture for you guys today. It's going to be a bit shorter than usual, and I'll tell you why right now. We are moving to chapter 13. What is called the sectional crisis, meaning that two sections of our country went to war with one another. The war was the Civil War, obviously. It started in 1861. And my cat also wants to participate in the sectional crisis. So she's here. So it was the war. Don't touch the camera. So the war was between the North and the South, in one sense, two sections of the society, North and the South. But it was also a war between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans in the North, led by Lincoln, and Democrats in the South, led by Jefferson Davis. So sectional crisis in many ways. Sections of the society, political parties went against one another. And you know the result, obviously. Abraham Lincoln won. With the Republican Party won. Don't touch the camera. So, yes, you're very important. Here, okay. But you gotta go. You gotta go because I need to talk here. All right. So, the sectional crisis is a watershed event in American history. In a way, we don't like to see it that way because it's embarrassing, but it's a failure of the American Revolution and the American Constitution. Namely, don't take my word for it. There had to be changes in the Constitution, and those changes were the amendments that were added as soon as the war ended, after the Civil War, namely that the amendment that abolished slavery. So there was a problem in the Constitution that defined, in terms like who can be a citizen, and that led to various vision of society that came into conflict in the Civil War, and one won. And it's not a good way to win the argument. It's what the ancient Romans called the argument of the baculum, of the baseball bat. Namely, you hit somebody with a baseball bat and says, "What do you think?" Well, yes, I agree with you. Well, that's in other words, that's not how you win the hearts and minds, so to speak. But as I was saying, Civil War was this watershed moment that one set of issues was resolved finally during the war, and the set of issue is I'm an intellectual historian, so I like to see these things in terms of ideas. And what I was telling you before, in terms of two different visions of American society. One was the vision of the Republicans in the North, and some Republicans in the South. Actually, most black people after the Civil War in the South joined the Republican Party en masse, in great numbers. The first black congressmen, the first black senators, they were all Republicans. And this was the vision of an industrial society that we started talking with Alexander Hamilton. It was a vision of society that produces, manufactures, and sells items, things, stuff, as we say. Those annoying things that you see on your phone, various advertising, buy this, buy that. That's what we do. Or as Calvin Coolidge used to say, president in the 1920s, the business of America is business. That's one vision of society. The different vision was the vision of Thomas Jefferson and Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson, James Polk, Martin Van Buren, the whole Democratic South, Democratic Party South. South was actually up until recently it was overwhelmingly Democratic. People forget that. So in many places, Democratic Party ruled the South from the very beginning to up until recently, when there has been some changes, but that's American history too. So, anyways, that was the vision of, we kind of take a symbol of that vision, the vision of Thomas Jefferson of an agrarian democracy, that everybody should be an independent farmer, gentleman. Those people are not like industrial workers who depend on their, if they have a job or not, right? The problem with industrial society is, well, it's all fine and dandy if you have a job, but if you don't, then you start wondering, well, what's the difference between me and the slave? A slave might be even in a better situation because slaves are fed, at least somewhat. And in industrial society, if you don't have a work, you don't eat, you die. So, those are the issues that we are facing right now, when the unemployment rate is growing, and the nasty side of industrial society sort of comes out to show itself. So there were these two visions, and those two visions crystallized eventually after going back and forth. Ideas circulate like memes on the internet. So ideas circulate, and they are then embodied in political parties. Political parties kind of then represent those ideas. That doesn't mean that everybody in those political parties share those ideas. There were Democrats who were pro-union and against slavery, and there were Republicans who were not willing to go to war over slavery. But this is what happened. Kind of the majority went in that direction. So, anyways, this watershed moment, to get back to that theme of Civil War as a watershed in American history, ends a period in American history. It ends our course. That's why this course is divided in Work History 1 and 2. And if I were to summarize the first part of the course and the second part of the course that is coming up next semester, U.S. History 2, the main issue in the first part of the course was the issue of slavery. We dealt with the issue of slavery all the way back when we started talking about Isabel la Católica, a Catholic queen of Spain, who patronized Columbus to cross the ocean blue. She explicitly said that those people in America cannot be enslaved if they convert to Catholicism. So the issue goes all the way back to 1492. And obviously, her ideals were not followed. And this issue of slavery comes to a war. It comes to a conflict in 1861. And then from 1861, you have a different set of issues. Namely, I would argue that from 1861 to today, that's our U.S. history too, the main issue that our society faces is the issue of immigration. In other words, it's not just an issue of immigration, I think it's important. It's important because the way American society operates, and you see this already in the early part of the 19th century, and especially in the later part of the 19th century, when Ellis Island opened and millions of people come rushing into the country. And the reason they were coming into the country was there were jobs. So immigrants are actually the working class of America. And therefore, they are very important for this vision of industrial society, which is kind of divided into, the upper classes and the owners of various industries like Bill Gates and stuff of that sort. And then the middle class, the technical class, the engineers, the lawyers, and so on and so forth. And finally, the great majority, the working class people, those who work and make things. Our working class has been, up until recently, mostly immigrant. And thus, because thus was our society, that means that the issue of immigration was at the forefront for the future course for U.S. history too. So anyways, because this book, American Job, tends to repeat itself, they don't want to go like I like to go into, people and their biographies and, stuff of that sort. Because I find, this personal touch to history fascinating, but they want to give you more. So they kind of repeat themselves. That's often called social history. And so chapter 13 is sort of, again, a summary of slavery, the issue of slavery in the United States. And it's a good thing to do because the issue of slavery was central for the Civil War. That's why it was fought. And there were all these endless debates, but I kind of find meaningless. There are debates about, little details. We're missing the whole picture. So was the Civil War really about the civil right, the states' rights, the state rights, or was it about slavery? And then the Confederate flag people would say, no, it's about states' rights. And then, anyways, and you have this endless bickering. Well, it's about all of these things because these things are packed into one. You have these two ideologies developed, embodied in two political parties, Republicans, led by Abraham Lincoln in the North, and the Democrats in the South. And they fight ideological battle. And that ideological battle is fought on many fronts. And then the issue, slavery was important, states' rights were important, the price of cotton was important. Everything, all of these are kind of linked into this ideological amalgam that led to the Civil War. So, anyways, so I'll be talking today a little less about slavery because, we covered a lot of this stuff. I add a couple of things, but not in the same way that the chapter does it. It has a beautiful map here on where the most highly concentrated slave population was, and that was the Mississippi River Valley, or what they call in the South the Mississippi River Delta, which when we think of Delta we think of New Orleans and Louisiana, but in the South Delta is all the way up to Memphis, Tennessee. So that Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, southern parts, and those have the highest concentration of black slaves at the time. And the second area that had the highest concentration of slaves was South Carolina. Actually, to this date, I'm not sure exactly. I haven't seen the statistic lately. It might have changed a little bit with what is called the Northerners coming to settle into the South, and they changed it. But up until recently, South Carolina was the only state in the Union which had the majority black population. And of course, Virginia. Virginia was the heart of the Confederacy. The heart of the Confederacy. So, anyways. Let me show you what I have for you for this chapter 13. It's called the Sectional Crisis. In terms of dates, we're talking about 1848, the very significant year in world history, war with Mexico over Texas and California, New Mexico, Arizona, and it ended up in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln and the coming together of many forces in the North under the umbrella of the Republican Party. So our Republican Party starts, if we take that the Democratic Party starts with Andrew Jackson, or even Thomas Jefferson, you can say now that the Republican Party starts now with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. So, therefore, the years 1848 to 1860, the years of the sectional crisis. But I want to talk about something else, namely the coming attraction, what's coming up in world history too. And that is the Irish potato famine. That's a very important event that happened basically from 1845 to 1849. But I take a year, 1848, as something easy to remember. So it was called the Great Famine or the Great Hunger, and it was a period of mass starvation and disease in Ireland. Ireland was part of United Kingdom for a very long time. But up until 1801, it was ruled as a separate kingdom, and those are, minor issues. It's a different way of ruling. As you know, United Kingdom is called United Kingdom because it was United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And these parts were separate kingdoms, and they were ruled separately. But in 1801, there was a union of kingdoms, one of the several in the phases. And Ireland became ruled directly by the Parliament in Westminster in London. And the executive power lay in the hands of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who was appointed by the British government. And the Ireland sent, 105 members of the Parliament to the House of Commons in London. And they sent their, peers, their peers into the House of Lords. So, what this represents an attempt by the Protestant establishment in the United Kingdom to unify the kingdom. The problem was that Ireland was full of Catholics, and they lived in Ireland in the conditions of poverty and insecurity. Up until 1829, they had no civil rights whatsoever. In 1829, the British Parliament did something what is called the Catholic Emancipation, and that is Catholics were allowed to some rights of citizenship. The problem was always, that goes back to the Protestant Reformation, that the Catholics were considered not loyal to the king or the queen of England. So in 1829, the Catholics were allowed, because in taking every public job, including the member of the Parliament in England, you have to swear loyalty to the king or the queen. And the king is in England still today. The queen is the head of the church in England, the Anglican Church, and that presents a problem for Catholics. And Catholics were not allowed not to take that oath, which was very difficult for Catholics to do because the head of the church is the Pope. And so these are the issues of the Catholic emancipation. So what I'm trying to say is actually that we have now, after 1848, for 1847, the wave of Catholic immigration starts. We have a change in American immigration structure. Up to 1848, the great majority, overwhelming majority of people who were coming to the United States to settle were actually Protestants, including Irish Protestants, people like Andrew Jackson, James K. Pollock, and stuff, those Scotch-Irish people that I mentioned before. But now, beginning with 1847, Catholics start coming in. And that's going to be the issue for American history too. Right. So I wanted to look at the Irish here in the United States. And whereas in Ireland has about 7 million people, 6.8 it says here in on slide number 4. And the overwhelming majority is Catholic. There is only a minority here in the north of Ireland, called Northern Ireland, that those people are Protestants. They don't like each other. They've been at war for hundreds of years. And That's the situation in Ireland. In America, on the other hand, there is about 33 million Americans are of Irish descent. Or at least they claim they are. Although a good chunk of Irish Protestants don't declare themselves as Irish Protestants, but as Americans, especially in the South. So, but that's about 10% of the total population of the United States. That's really important. That explains some interesting things, like, I don't know, New York leaning towards the Confederacy during the Civil War. Anyways, but we'll get to that. It's just, I don't want to rush too fast. So, in the United States, the majority of Irish are actually Protestant. About 60% are Protestant. People of Irish origin are Protestants. And you see that in let's see, two maps that I have following. One I kind of rearranged these slides a little bit. So this is now slide number 4, and you have the example of the potato blight. That's the parasite that attacked potatoes in Ireland, and just basically turned potatoes into dust. And for the great majority of Catholics in Ireland, the situation in Ireland was the Protestants were the landowners, and the Catholics were people who worked on the land, what we would call, sharecroppers or serfs. So this was a two-tier society. In many ways, it was a two-tier society as the American South. And that's why I kind of talk about this, because it's an interesting comparison. So Ireland was a two-tier society where the Protestants owned the land and the Catholics didn't own the land, but they worked the land. And they were living off the land, and the main crop was potato. And for several years, for 3 or 4 years, beginning in 1845, the potato crops just failed because of this blight. And there was famine in Ireland. And to make things even worse, in power in England was the Liberal Party, a Liberal Prime Minister. And the Liberal Party, much like Democratic Party in the United States, advocated free trade and grain that could have fed the Irish population was being exported, among other places, to Russia. But anyways, so you have these ideological issues of, for example, free trade and protectionism at work here. And the same issue was at work in the United States, that the Southern Democrats were those who were for free trade, and they were for free trade because they could import things cheaply. And the Northern Republicans were not for free trade. They were for tariffs. They wanted to protect American industries, and therefore tariffs, barriers, outside barriers need to be posted so that outside producers like Chinese now, or at that time the British, don't crush our growing industries. I don't want you to get an impression that these are kind of one is good and one is bad. It depends on the situation. If you're growing your industry, it's sensible to have protection, but at some point that protection protects sloppy work. So you can get to a point where you can your industry is protected by tariffs, and therefore it produces second-rate quality. And like, for example, automobile industry in the United States suffered from this problem that was protected by barriers, and then famously Ronald Reagan allowed Japanese car to come in, and we started buying Japanese cars, and now I drive a Honda that is made in Ohio. So those are the issues that go all the way back to the 19th century and are related to the potato famine. But they're also related to the Irish immigration into the United States. And therefore, I'm looking at slide number 6, and that's where the Irish Protestants were. So Irish Protestants didn't come to the United States with potato famine. They came earlier and they came afterwards, but independently from the Irish Catholics. So you see at the map that the great majority of the Irish Protestants, what we call the Scotch Irish, immigrated into the south. We have this county by county map, and you look at New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, New England. Those people who came from during the colonial times and after the Republic was founded were mostly of English descent. But if you go into southern Ohio, southern Indiana, Kentucky, Virginia, especially the core was Kentucky and Tennessee, and then into Texas and all throughout the South, these are Irish Protestant immigrants dominate. And you have slide number 7, the Irish Catholic immigration to the United States. It's a little bit older map, but it's exactly the opposite of what we had on the previous map. The great majority of Irish Catholics came to the great cities of the north, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, New York, right? Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, Buffalo too. You see there by the shores of the Lake Ontario, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, the Finger Lakes area. Anyways, but the main concentration are the 3 great metropolitan areas of the East Coast: Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And you know by now that this is the area of the country where you have the highest concentration of Catholics, not just Irish, but Catholics in general, in contrast to the South being a predominantly Protestant area with very few Catholics around, except in South Texas. But anyways, that's all American history too. What I wanted to do here is to kind of give you introduction to this shift from slavery towards immigration. This change that happened in American politics. In particular, I have a couple of interesting pictures over here. You have slide number 8, Old St. Patrick Cathedral. It was built in 1810, I believe. So it's one of the oldest Catholic churches in the United States. If you compare this one, the reason I posted it here, it's interesting, it's fascinating. It's in around Houston streets. Or is it 14th? 14th Street? But it's the southern tip of the Manhattan Peninsula, and it was the largest Catholic church, Cathedral of New York. But it's interesting to compare that church. If you go to New York, and we go often, not now, but we used to when we could. You compare this old church, which is basically kind of like a small country church, to the new cathedral that the Catholics built, the new St. Patrick Cathedral, after the Civil War. And it will give you a clear idea of how the Civil War changed the fate of not just Black Americans in the United States, but in particular, ordinary workers here Irish Catholics were mostly ordinary workers here at the time in the United States. So a couple of other things. I have a picture of a Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall is was a democratic political machine in the United States. It was in this time period mostly run by Irish. The most important person in it was an old club that goes all the way back to the Revolution. But when Fernando Wood became mayor of New York City, he became the Grand Master of the Tammany Hall, and Tammany Hall was a political machine. And it's an indication of the new way how to run things in the country. The politics of, genteel Southern slave owners like Jefferson and well, Andrew Jackson was not so genteel, but he was a slave owner nonetheless. So, these elites, Southern elites that, slow talking and great rhetoricians, they loved neoclassical buildings, the plantations, and that politics will be gone with the Civil War. They'll be wiped out. That sort of elite character of the South is presented in the movies like Gone with the Wind and things of that sort. Anyways, so there was a new kind of politics coming in, urban politics, and the North, which won the Civil War, was an urban environment. Fernando Wood was elected mayor in 1854 of New York City, and then he was re-elected in 1860. And he was a mayor who actually wanted to New York to secede from the United States. And the reason for it was he wanted New York to secede from the United States and declare itself a free city in order to continue its profitable cotton trade. Namely, Southerners were selling cotton, and one of the great buyers of cotton is New York. New York was, we have a garment district, and textile industries were, throughout the history of New York, very, very important for New York. It's the fashion center of the world. Anyways, I'll refrain from commenting. So that fashion industry depended on Southern cotton, and cotton was made by slaves in the Confederacy, and therefore, anyways, that's what he suggested. It didn't really work, but it's important to know about this political machine called Tammany Hall, and to kind of contradict the picture that it's like certain picture that the North was completely Republican and the South was completely Democrat. There are always exceptions that prove the rule, so to speak, as the ancient Romans used to say. Exceptions that prove the rule. Anyways, that was about Fernando Woods and New York and immigration. There is a picture of Fernando Wood on slide number 11. And finally, I get back to this compromise of 1850 a little bit later. I wanted to say a couple of things about. So then let me move these two slides somewhere in the back, because we leave this for the next lecture. But then after Fernando Wood and this Tammany Hall and this Irish Catholic, it's not entirely Catholic, it's kind of Irish Catholic and Protestant political machine in New York. The next slide I put here is Frederick Douglass. And I'm sort of wondering, and probably you guys are. So, well, wait a second. You were talking about Irish immigrants, and now we're talking about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, what's the connection? Well, the connection is that Frederick Douglass was a slave in Maryland. He was probably the most famous slave in the whole of 19th century, in the whole world. He wrote this two main biographies. One that he wrote in 1845, an autobiography, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And it became a bestseller. Even in the United States, it became a bestseller. And then he wrote another book in 1855, My Bondage and My Freedom. And he went on a tour of Europe talking about slavery in the United States and became a celebrity at the time. I'm not sure it's necessarily good that he was a celebrity, but he was very influential in what is called the abolitionist movement, and therefore he contributed a lot to the freedom of many slaves, in particular, the freedom that came in the end through war. But the reason I put Frederick Douglass here in the context of Irish Catholic urban immigration is that this is the shift that he made. He was born a slave, living in the Jeffersonian system of, plantation owners, genteel plantation owners who had hundreds of slaves working for them. And he moved out of that environment and came to the north and started living in various places, New York, Boston, and so forth. And he became an industrial worker. Another example is Harriet Tubman, a legendary abolitionist, a woman who organized arms groups to get into the South and grab slaves and brought those freed slaves to the North. And then, well, what do you do when you come as a former slave to the North? Well, you start looking for a job suddenly, and you become an industrial worker. So that's why I picked up Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass as an example of this transition from one society into the other, and that is kind of reflected in their life, from a slave to an industrial worker, to a worker. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery, escaped, and subsequently made some 13 missions to rescue approximately 70 slaves, including family and friends, using the network of anti-slavery activists and safe houses known as the Underground Railroad. And that's important. That's sort of an issue that popped up very, very, that led to the Civil War, that contributed to the beginning of the Civil War. Namely, you have here on slide number 14, the Underground Railroad. The issue was that unstable political situation. If you look at this slide number 17. And when Texas and California joined the Union. And there was always a question of the balance between the slave states and the free states. And then these territories in the West, Minnesota Territory, Unorganized Territory, New Mexico Territory, Utah Territory, Oregon Territory. Are these territories going to come as slave states or as free states? So we'll get to this more next time around, because I don't want to focus today too much on presidents and politics. Today I want to focus on ordinary people, the workers, the immigrants, the slaves, the former slaves. But as a part of this compromise, we had a Missouri Compromise before, which kind of said, okay, this 36.5 parallel, it's going to be a division between, and that's the northern boundary of Arkansas. So above it's going to be free state, below it's going to be slave state, except Missouri is going to be an exception. Anyways, that's a minor point. But there was again in 1850 an attempt to create some sort of a compromise, and that compromise meant that you have to swallow some bitter pills. One of the most difficult pills to swallow for the Northerners was the idea that the slave fugitive laws had to be enforced in the North. So it meant that if a slave escapes from Virginia and crosses over into Pennsylvania, the Mason-Dixon line, so-called, the police in Pennsylvania is supposed to return that person back into Virginia, back into the slave state. It's often hard to imagine how that looked like, but you had to change trains. For example, if you're traveling from Philadelphia to Baltimore, the trains were not segregated in Philadelphia, but then the trains were segregated in Baltimore and in Washington, in the South. So the black people needed to move into the special carriages that were added. Anyways, a couple of interesting things there. One of the bitter pills for the Northerners was this slave fugitive law that was adopted in 1850 as a part of a larger compromise between the slave states and free states, which obliged all the sheriffs in the United States, free states and slave states, that they will return the slaves back to their owners. This led to smuggling. Namely, Northerners started organizing networks that were called the Underground Railroad. It was not a railroad, it was basically a network of taverns. And where you can also sleep, right? Hotels in some way, where slaves could actually sleep over on their way to Canada. What is important that from 1850 to 1861, it became because of this law, it became very difficult for slaves to stay, former slaves, runaway slaves, to stay in the northern United States, and they continued into Canada. So the main crossing point actually was Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo. But Detroit was by far the largest. Namely, so Underground Railroad is the system. We have a map here on slide number 14. A system of friends, tavern owners, who are willing to hide fugitive slaves, help them come over to Detroit, and then on slide number 16, Detroit is on the border with Canada. And there you have a monument, it's called the Gateway to Freedom. The fugitive slaves would be taken across the river into Canada, where Canada was at that time part of Great Britain, and there the slaves could continue living as free people. This is well documented, and there are a lot of monuments and a lot of memorials dedicated to this Underground Railroad. In particular, here I have a link for you guys on slide number 15 to a C-SPAN video that will give you an idea how a particular church in Detroit, a Baptist church in Detroit, was part of this Underground Railroad. But what I wanted to add is that this was not the only gateway for American fugitive slaves. people like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass that we mentioned before, right? They came into the North before this fugitive slave law of 1850, and therefore they became free people. But after 1850, that avenue was closed. And so from 1850 to 1861, you have slavery becoming a very, very contentious issue, because all the way around the North you have fugitive slaves coming through, and then they're being transported to Canada as a great embarrassment for a republic that claims the right to life and pursuit of happiness, right? That's what's written in the Constitution. So this part of Underground Railroad network is well researched, and you have, as you can see on the video, there are tours there. You can see, museum exhibitions, there are monuments like this beautiful Gateway to Freedom on Detroit River, on the Detroit facing Canada. It's on the main square in Detroit, Central Square in Detroit, where the City Hall of Detroit is, and across the river is Canada, Windsor, Canada, where there is another monument also similar to this one. But what is not often mentioned is that some slaves were fleeing to Texas, to Mexico, Mexico was an independent republic, defeated by the United States in the War of 1848, but still an independent republic which did not allow slavery. And some slaves actually went into Mexico. So I'm saying this because from 1850, and this is now slide number 17, the Compromise of 1850, which was a big political compromise, which included this fugitive slave law, which created a lot of problems and a lot of embarrassment for the United States, that you have this river of people crossing the border into Canada or into Mexico. So, and the last slide is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is kind of the falling apart of the Compromise of 1850. In other words, when fights started happening in Kansas and Nebraska over whether these territories are going to be slave or free, and the rise of Stephen Douglas, the opponent of Abraham Lincoln. But we leave this for next time. I don't want to give out everything now. I think this is going to be enough for now. Somewhat, I some of the things that are mentioned in chapter 13, I kind of stick with, and I talked about it, but I added some things that I kind of think made this chapter a little bit more interesting than being just a repetition of. Pardon me, that's my cats. So that should be enough for now, and we continue then on. Pardon me. Yeah. So that should be enough for now, and we continue then next time. That would be Friday. On Wednesday, we're going to do the IDs. So, chapter 13, sectional crisis, Democrats and Republicans, slave states, free states, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Irish Catholics in New York. That's all what I have for you guys today. See you next time. Bye.